Our special guest today is Dr. Thomas Dutta. He is more widely known as the Quiet Warrior, forging a life shaped by resilience, reflection, and hard-earned insight. Navigating the high-pressure corporate world as a CEO, he came to a defining realization. True leadership is grounded not in authority, but in authenticity and in the courage to elevate others. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A severe brain injury upended his life, forcing him into a far deeper test of endurance and identity. Yet rather than surrendering, Tom rebuilt his life. Through immense health challenges, he continued forward, authoring best-selling books and creating the Quiet Warrior podcast, where he engages with remarkable guests on stories of adversity, healing, and the indomitable human spirit. His recently completed doctoral thesis extends this mission even further, exploring critical themes such as mental health and generational trauma, areas that resonate deeply in today's world. On a personal note, I've had the privilege of following Tom's journey over the past few years as a good friend, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the show today, Tom.
Oh, it's great to be with you. I was going to say great to be back with you. The audience may not know, but I finished my doctorate degree just a month or so ago, and you were on the panel as one of the examiners. So less pressure today, but it's nice to be back.
Absolutely, and I really enjoyed doing it, and we were so impressed by your journey. And of course, that's my first question. Of you've lived through both corporate success and this profound personal disruption. And looking back, what was the moment that most clearly reshaped how you see yourself today?
Well, if I look back, I mean, I start with childhood, and then the early years really were full of childhood, what I call adversity or trauma. And then quickly, I went into the corporate sector and became a high level executive. So I think a CEO at the age of 31. What was interesting, Rhino, is through that journey, I didn't realize that I had made up stories in my mind about who I was. And I had these, they call them neural adaptations. So the way the brain works, I've learned is if there's parts of our story that are missing information, the brain does a really cool thing. It just fills in and makes things up. So imagine being 31 years old, and that's the first moment you become a chief executive. And the way you're seeing the world is through what I now know is a lie. In other words, I thought I wasn't good enough. My father left me when I was 12 years old. He was an addicted alcoholic. Thought it was my fault. And I couldn't accept success, become a CEO. And then all of a sudden you find out, do I really deserve this? Is this imposter? Why is Tom getting all this recognition? And so I went through that chapter. It was about 2 decades being a high level leader and working in many sectors. And then it was the turning point was actually the brain injury. And you said that it's kind of scary listening to somebody else tell you you went through a brain injury. But in August 2018, I was doing the Ride to Conquer Cancer. And it's a 2 day bike ride, about 150 miles. And it was split over 2 days. And so a buddy of mine who's an engineer, his daughter died from leukemia. And we were having a beer on my patio because I was actually doing some coaching of him and his teams. And he said, would you like to ride? And I said, what's that? And he told me, and I said, sure. I said, I don't have a bike. So I went and borrowed a buddy's bike. And I was like that, let's just do it. And so that summer, this was 2018, I rode from my home here in Port Moody, BC, to what we know as Chilliwack, BC. Uh, Chilliwack, like a cold slap. And rode 125 kilometers. And that night was a team dinner. And so there were 80 of us on the riding team and about 1,600 riders, Rhino. And I went to shower, stepped in a low cut bathtub in a motel. And I don't even remember it because of the injury, but both my feet went out like this. I fell backwards and cowered, and I broke the fall of my head. And they tell me from an engineering report that I fell at the velocity of 47 Gs, which is like 110-mile-an-hour baseball being fired at your head. Or they said it's like an elephant, 300-pound elephant standing on your skull for 15 seconds. Well, I blacked out in the tub. My wife was outside the door in the motel. She came in and because she heard me screaming, water was cascading. And I actually split the porcelain part of the tub by hitting this back part of my head, which cracked it. And the vision center in your brain is inside that part of your head. And then later we realized I had lacerations on the top of my head, which matched the cuts in the back of the backsplash of the tub. Now I'm being graphic for a reason because the crazy part about it is I blacked out and came to that night. I sat in the hotel motel, literally leaning against the backboard of the bed. I couldn't sleep. I had this ringing headache. And I don't know if you know anything about hockey. You know, hockey players were in Canada, right? The Canucks. You know, hockey players get concussions, they get their bell rung, and they don't even know if they've never had one. So they get back up and go on the ice and play. Well, I was so stupid. I took a bag of Tylenol, and at 5 a.m., I got up, put my riding helmet on. It was very sore and my gear, and I went down to the team truck. And the team, I told my captain what happened. He says, "You're not riding." I said, "Yes, your daughter died from leukemia, so I have to finish this ride for her." And I got on the bike, Rhino, and I did the next 125 kilometers. I literally was looking at my pedals one step at a time using, I guess, resilience. And I finished. And it was after that point that we got home and went to the doctor next day. And she said, "Tom, you've had a brain injury." Now, we didn't know how bad it was, but if you knew me back then, I couldn't walk straight. I couldn't orate and talk. My executive function was all scrambled. The worst part is I had damaged my vision. I still have some challenges, but I had double vision, convergence, divergence problems. So why am I going to this long story? Because you asked me a simple question. It's because trauma isn't simple. So if I can just continue from there, and please stop me if you want to clarify anything. The It took me 5 years to recover, and I went into an advanced neuroplasticity clinic where they taught my brain. They rewired it through exercise and all. It's called neuroplasticity. You have it, I have it till we're older. And my gait fixed, my balance fixed. And all of a sudden, my words started coming out and matching the speed of my brain, the old speed, but the eyes were still broken. What I didn't expect was in the first 3 months after the injury, I slipped into depression. And a lot of people don't talk about that with mental illness and concussions, but it's the ugly side. So just imagine your life stops. I'm a performing executive, and all of a sudden I have no way to earn an income. I can't support my family. And I didn't even know if I could walk, talk, or function. When I slipped into depression, about 3 months, I had suicidal ideation. So crazy thoughts and things happening. And I went to see Margaret, my doctor, and she said, "Get your butt into some kind of work." Because she says, "You're sitting at home ruminating." So I went and worked for 2 years doing physical labor as a night stalker, forklift driver at a large warehouse. And then another year for a friend waiting tables, serving beer and pizza. Now, coming from being a C-level guy to that was crazy. Well, what happened was in the therapy to deal with the mental illness, I started seeing a psychiatrist, Dr. Ron, who's a good friend now. And I still have a psychiatrist in my care team. And we were going through all this processing, right, to deal with my depression. And remember, we were talking about 2, 3 years. And there was moments in that where I didn't even know who I was anymore. And my thinking was so off. And I questioned even my marriage. And I had to get some help understanding even the relationship I had with my wife. When I got through the suicidal ideation and figuring out all this stuff, and the depression started leveling out, I said to Dr. Ron one day, I said, "Doc, can we deal with something else? There's this awful feeling I have that just has been with me all my life, and it's I can't understand it. It's like this icky feeling." And he said this to me. He says, "Tom, I'm telling you right now, I want to get you well. You're doing a doctor degree. I want to get you through depression." He said, if we tackle whatever that is, if it was a home renovation for you, it's a complete teardown." and, and so I went there and I said, "Okay, let's leave that." So now this is back in 2022 or 2023. Okay. So we're now 2026. So 5 years, I got physically and mentally stronger. The depression, I managed to get through that and finished my degree. And I went back to Dr. Ron and I said, Ron, we got to tackle this issue because I just graduated my doctorate and I have this fleeting feeling of that there's danger, something's not right. I said, and so he connected me with another therapist and they explored PTSD. And for your audience, and maybe I can touch on it in a little bit if you want to, there's a test they had me do called the ACE test. Have you heard of it? Adult childhood experience. And I got to warn you, if you ever do it, and it's online, you can do it. I have it here on my other computer. I can cite it. What they do is they look at, it says the ACE test is adverse childhood experience. These are questions used in the original CDC Kaiser study. And the questions ask you before your 18th birthday, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often do the following? And there's 10 questions, Reino. If you get a high score on that, it could indicate you've got PTSD. Well, I almost aced the test. I'm not proud of it, but I got 9 out of 10. And what they say is if you get 4 or more, you have serious challenges with relationships and with the way you think from trauma.
So what are
If
you saying, Tom, is that this injury brought up this generational trauma from your subconscious mind?
Yes, so going through the journey of mental illness, falling on my head, almost losing my function in my life, going through recovery and discovering that there's something not right and paying attention to it, uh, realize that there was unresolved trauma that goes way back even to childhood. And as a functioning CEO, like most leaders, I had just buried that. I didn't even understand what it was. It wasn't something that I could actually label and talk about. So that is the answer in a long way. But the simple answer is the turning point was when I discovered through the brain injury that I needed to go and get help and start learning about the missing parts of Tom. And a lot that I learned, the doctorate work I did, including my ancestral heritage, which is another chapter of this whole discovery.
Yes, the interesting thing about your biography is that you traced back your roots in India. You went and traced your
Yeah,
father's history, and you discovered amazing things that were embedded in your personal history. If you could just tell us a bit
sure.
about that.
Yeah, I have on my book stack here. These are all books that I've read through guests that come through my own podcast. And right where I'm pointing to there, there's a blue one. And I just had the thesis bound. So it's 300 pages. You've read it. And so what happened through the research and the doctorate over the few years was my professor, who was my director of studies, Kate. She said, you should explore your ancestral heritage because I was doing a critique of all my public work and discovering through my lived experiences the deeper meanings in it. And I went into Google and I don't know if people know this, but if you go into Google and you put Google Scholar, you put the words, there's another search engine. And so I put in the word Fiji, which is my parents were born and raised in the Fiji Islands in Suva. I was born in England before coming to Canada. It's a long story. And the word Talanoa came up. Talanoa, Talanoa. And Talanoa is the way the Pacific Islanders used to communicate. They would sit in circles, the village elders, the tribal people, and they would talk, talk, talk. Unlike North America, where you have positionality or you have an agenda right now, they would just come and you could talk about anything. Talk about your village, talk about your ancestors. So what I was doing is I started getting curious about Talanoa. It reminded me of my childhood. My father used to have parties, drinking parties, but he'd have everybody sit on the floor and drink the traditional kava drink, the drink of Fiji. And they were talk, talk, talk. And they were doing this relational dialogue called Talanoa. So as I went further, I started having more questions about how does Fiji and how does my roots factor in? And I remembered that my father used to talk about a gentleman named Lali Mirage. And that was my great grandfather, who I never knew. Now, my father was an alcoholic. He passed away in 2018 from alcoholism. He was 23 years with AA, so he had changed, but he ruined his body. His dad was an alcoholic, but Lali Maraja didn't know who he was. So I went, and it just was a whole other podcast episode we could do, talking about all the steps to find this part of me, my history. But I met a gentleman who did research, and through a series of things, searching a database, I discovered who my great grandfather was. His name was actually Bhagwan Ram. Now, Lali Mirage was the name they gave to him in Fiji. For those who may not know the native language of Fiji, Lali means candy, and Maharaj is given to people of high regard. And so my father told me when I was younger that we're part of the caste system. If we're in, he's his roots are to India, and so we are the Brahmin caste, which is the highest level of caste in India. All this was so confusing to me, and this was all missing information. Getting back to what I was telling you, the neural adaptations of how I was a CEO, a leader, was making up stories because I didn't know all of this parts of me. So anyway, going back to the research, this they helped me find the ship's pass. Was a slavery pass, a pass that my great grandfather, uh, Bhagwan Ram, at age 17, he was put on a ship in India and lied to and sent over to Fiji to work on the plantations. And this was called the Girmitias. And it was a whole era where the British set up a system of indentured labor, sent millions of people around the world to work in plantations and things. It was horrible. So all of a sudden I'm going like, my great grandfather was a slave. It's crazy. And then when I researched what the Germitias went through, it was terrible. They were tortured. They were put in coolie huts. The stories go on and on and on. And there's a good documentary film recently premiered here in Canada about it. And when I started learning about the horrific parts of that, I went, my grandfather's great grandfather survived that. Now, he survived that. And then I discovered that in Fiji, he owned a candy store. Lali in the language means candy. And my dad wrote about this, and I found some of his writings. Lali used to support 20 families. So he built this candy store. He'd give candy to all the kids who came by it. And over his lifetime in Fiji, he was revered because he supported 20 families and he became somebody bigger than life. That was the first time where I discovered that I'm proud of my heritage. I used to hate my heritage. I didn't even know what it was. I used to hate my dad, but it's like, my God, these are the roots and the grounds I stand on. So it was the first time that turning moment again in my gut was, I'm actually I'm actually proud of who I am.
Was that turning point knowing, discovering the history of your grandfather as being a kind, warm-hearted person
Yeah.
who served his
So
community?
yeah, yeah. I mean, oh my God, I'm laughing because I'm assuming any guy who has a candy store and gives it out free to kids, and the way people talk about him, even people I know today, say, I knew Lali Mirage, and I have a picture of him somewhere. But I think is true. However, there's more to it than that because generation trauma is very complex. So I'm going now to back to my father. I hated dad, and I never thought he loved me and all these things. And he was physical and mentally abusive to the family, but I took the brunt of it. So I used to say I was a black and blue kid. My dad was in the army, commanding officer, but he used to punch and hit and call names and say things, right, that your brain can't unsee as a kid. When I discovered this chapter of Lali Mirage, his great grandfather, I went, I remember one day going like, oh my God, I can't imagine how my dad lived. Now, my dad's dad was an alcoholic. So I started piecing this together, and this is part of generational trauma. Bhagwan Ram was an indentured laborer, survived and became something great. He gave birth to my dad's dad, my grandfather, who passed away young as an alcoholic. But perhaps the trauma and the emotions and the way my great grandfather maybe parented and raised him, that was passed down. My dad's dad lived probably a very difficult life.
Mm-hmm.
And then my father gets in the army and becomes an alcoholic and starts drinking heavily and destroys his life. And that comes into my life. So you can see the generations, all this passes down, and it has many pieces to it. And I think that's really the biggest turning point for me was I realized my dad was a good man. I discovered that I loved him dearly. He was a very good person. He was very intelligent. He really did a lot to help people. But I didn't know this other part of the story, which all of a sudden the light bulb comes on where I can say, you know what, Rhino? Now I understand why dad was a jerk. Now I understand why his life was the way it was. It had nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
And this is what happens with
From your
trauma.
research, Tom, how much of behavior is inherited, do you think? And how much is consciously chosen? Because there came a point in your life where you
Yeah.
broke the cycle.
Yeah. I want to just read a note here that I made because it relates to this. I want your audience to know what the definition of trauma is that I use. So trauma. I never knew this because people use it loosely. Oh, I'm traumatized. Trauma. What is it? Trauma comes from the Greek word for wound, and so trauma is not just a terrible thing that happens to you. It's what happens inside you when an experience is so painful or frightening that your mind and body cannot make sense of it at the time. Now, here's a few more nuggets. It gets stored in your body and your feelings, not just in the memories, not just in the thoughts. It's the pain left behind when something bad happened that was too big to deal with alone. And it can be passed from parent to child or grandparent to parent, whatever, through behaviors, through silence, the way the families treat each other, often without anyone realizing it. So I think that your question there is it relates directly to this
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
the trauma I experienced. I mean, I didn't even know about these pieces, but the trauma is not necessarily just
Mhm.
my own. It's other people's
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah. But you realized that y the trauma your father had in going into becoming an alcoholic was a coping mechanism.
Yeah, it was, I guess they call it adaptations, but yeah, I would imagine because remember I said to you that I had this icky feeling that I was telling my doc about, right? That just it keeps hanging around. I would imagine my dad, and I think I said this to you when we talked about my thesis, that yeah, I think my dad began drinking to calm his mind, to deal with these things that were going on inside him, and I don't think he even understood. I think he might have been mentally ill himself, having depression and anxiety. And as we know, alcohol creates good feelings, right? And it
Yeah.
becomes
Yeah.
addictive. Yeah.
Now, your life was upended from one day to the next. I see some people who've had terrible car accidents where their life changed from one day to the next, or who had a terrible fall, or who suddenly got a life-threatening diagnosis. What message would you give people in a similar situation?
Well, I think the first advice is we have a fundamental interdependence with each other. So you can't get through that on your own. And this was what I had to do is I started, let me back up as a CEO. When you're a CEO, it's lonely at the top. And you're taught by your father, don't complain, don't ask for help. So we navigate through life on our own. However, when you go through a life-changing injury or something, some event, there's a tendency for us to retreat and go become depressed and hide and not want to deal with the pain and the problems and people. My advice is you got to fight through that and you've got to reach out. So if you look at my story, even the parts of it I've been telling you, I reached out to a researcher to find my ancestral heritage. That knowledge I couldn't get alone. I reached out to an advanced brain clinic to help me fix the changes that were in my brain. I reached out to a therapist to do psychiatry to deal with things I couldn't understand. I was feeling the embodied part of trauma and suicidal thoughts, things that I'd never had before. I
But there was
reached
a
out.
part of you that authentically realized, I need help. I can't do this alone. But if
Yeah.
you're in a leadership position, that can f be perceived by others as being a weakness. How do you confront that?
Yeah, and the easy answer is that's absolutely wrong. And what you said is what it's true. Most leaders think that it's there's a word vulnerability, but most leaders think if I show weakness or if I reach out for help and say I don't know something, or there's a lot of pressure, come out of a board meeting and I just feel really stressed, and when that you show weakness, you're no good anymore. And the funny thing is it's the opposite. Being vulnerable, asking for help is a strength. It's a big, big strength. And if you layer in some of the other things that I learned through my research about masks we wear, you can see my studio, there's various masks,
Mm.
artifacts. Leaders wear a performative mask. So if this is the mask, I'm now Tom Dutta, the CEO. I'm tough. I'm strong. I know the answers. So as soon as I walk into that office or that boardroom or that meeting, I'm wearing a performative mask that, quite frankly, I didn't choose, but it's put on me because of the constraints in the organization. Now, let's just say that you work for a boss who's like my dad was. Hey, don't complain. You got to be tough. You're telling me you're having a tough time with this Tom, you're weak, right? That's how we think.
Mm.
But the truth is, it's ass backwards. It's like, no, when we do this, we peek out from behind that performative mask. All of a sudden, Rhino or the people I work with are starting to see the real Tom.
Mm.
So if I'm having a conversation with you and it's stressful and I'm a leader, I might say, can we just stop for a minute? Is anybody here feeling a little stressed? Because I am. And then you see the shoulders in the room sink. What happens in the brain when that happens, and this is the neuroscience piece, when you can see me, a piece of me in my story, I give you permission to see a piece of you in my story. And when you're talking to me, I'm seeing the parts of me in you. Now, can you imagine if you just don't talk about yourself, you don't become vulnerable, you don't share any feelings or emotions or things, even weaknesses? Can you imagine? We just wouldn't grow emotionally. And so what leaders need to do, and they need to understand this, and I developed a new framework in the thesis that I'm trademarking right now. It's a new orientation, a new way of thinking to address that lie that you told me. You didn't do it intentionally, but that lie we've all been telling, which is we can't show our weakness. We can't be vulnerable because it's going to show that maybe we're not capable of being that leader. And what I've created was this orientation that in the first conversations I'm having with you, if I can get you to say, geez, Tom's kind of like me, or I feel good around this guy, Tom. So I want to talk to him more. I want to perform at a higher level. Tom's allowing me to be seen and heard. So because he's showing a bit of himself, his weakness, his vulnerability. I think that I can grow as a human being and I can perform even stronger for him in the work
Yeah,
that I'm doing.
yeah. Yeah, I
And
remember we
this,
discussed this while you were presenting your thesis, and we all agreed that there was an enormous need
yeah,
in the corporate world for vulnerable leadership, exactly what you were pointing out now.
yeah.
There's a real need for authenticity, a need for vulnerability, because in my experience in doing more than 300 workshops in the corporate environment is that high absenteeism is directly related to just this topic.
Oh, totally. I mean, you get me going here, so on my soapbox and look, the other words that are out there around this topic is trauma informed, right? So what does it mean to have trauma informed leadership? Well, let me just back up for a minute. Let's just say that somewhere in your lifeline, Reno, you had experiences that were traumatic, all right? Things had happened,
Oh, there
whether
were
it's
many,
right.
many. Yeah.
So now just imagine that I'm your boss and I'm working with you and I'm command and control. Just, I want you to do this. I want you to do this and pushing you and pushing you. Now, if I realize that people I might be leading may have had trauma in their lives. And so when you've had trauma, there's a whole different orientation that you have to use to lead those people. Now, that's not saying that you're weak. It's not saying that you're ever going to say publicly in a meeting room that my dad used to do drink and used to be physically abusive to me, etc. You might not do that. But if I'm leading you, I have to understand that there may be something I say, there may be a way I use my face, my voice that might trigger your past trauma. Now, remember, trauma can happen. Like I could be sitting here with you, like I'm now. You could say something or look at me in a certain way, and the way my brain is being developed, which isn't being very healthy from trauma, is I might all of a sudden have my sympathetic nervous system come on, which puts me in a state of high alert. I might see danger right now in this moment. You don't know that. And so all of a sudden, I'm starting to retreat or behave a certain way, or maybe I'm going to fight. I'm going to be combative. I'm going to be assertive. This happens all the time in
Mm,
business
mm.
business rooms, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
if you're trauma, if you're informed as a leader that trauma exists in most people, and so you can create a different way of communicating, a different way of saying, okay, I'm going to listen to Rhino versus talking. I'm going to listen more. I'm going to empathize with him. I'm going to let him feel me that I might feel what's happening with him. I'm going to accept him. I'm not going to, like leaders tend to do, cut him off and just tell him my opinion. I'm going to accept him unconditionally. That doesn't mean that I have to agree with everything, but I'm going to accept him, meaning I'm going to let him finish. I'm going to say, I understand. I have a different point of view, but thanks for sharing that. And then I'm going to dare to come out from beneath that mask and maybe show you something about me that I wouldn't, which makes you connect deeper to me emotionally and in your brain. And the last one is we're going to keep doing this. So rather than these short little conversations leaders have, like they're performative. You, Tom, to get your paycheck, do A, B, and C. See you later. How about we open up relationships and have relational dialogue? Because the last thing I'll say on this piece, it's not what you say and it's not what I say, Reno. It's what happens in the space between us, the quiet revelations. So here's what's happening. You say something, and I'm now reflecting on what you're saying. I'm using my mind to critically think. And what's happening is my brain is going, I remember something like what he said. So we have all of a sudden, we're creating new thoughts between us and new knowledge emerges in between us. And when new knowledge emerges in between business leaders, we flourish, we grow, and we can create innovations. We can create new things. We can solve problems. We can create cultures that are healthy and mentally stronger just by having this relational dialogue, but
yeah.
doing it from a trauma informed point of view where we
Mm.
just don't know what we get. And I
Yeah,
can tell you,
you're
most
absolutely
people
addressing
haven't.
an
Yeah.
important point because I think AI is going to uh, revolutionize our work environment, and then leaders with social skills, with human skills, are going to be far more important. We really need those people who can listen, those leaders who can listen, and
Yeah.
who can express their own vulnerability and just delve into that a bit more because your whole philosophy is the quiet warrior. Um,
It's counterintuitive though.
what is your definition of the quiet warrior?
Well, it's I said this I think in the examination it from quiet warrior to quiet revelation, you know, let that land. So I'll just tell you when I was having a conversation with Professor Kate, my director of studies, and for those who don't know, if you do a doctorate, it's a massive thing. And I'm not saying this for ego, but it's like no other degree because you're not only do you have to do research and write a thesis, then you're examined. You have to defend and prove your work. And man, having four professors for 2 hours ask you questions. And so we're having this conversation with Kate one day in my first year of my studies. So every 2 weeks we'd have a Zoom call. And she's very smart. She created the program in the Faculty of Business and Law at the university. And I think highly of her. And she has a psychology background too. And she says, quiet warrior. She said, those two words don't go together very well, quiet and warrior. They're kind of counter to it. Here's the cool thing. Back then, when she said that to me, I started reflecting because that's what you do when you research. You have critique your work. I started going like, she's damn right. It doesn't make any sense. Why the hell am I branding myself as the quiet warrior? So where did that come from? You need to know, your audience needs to know that. In 2012, we went through a terrible circumstance in our lives. We were victims of a Ponzi scheme. My wife and I were both professionals, very well paid and all that at the time. But somebody took all our money and we had to restart over again financially. It was horrible. My daughter was in high school, private school, expenses were big, but we literally hit the wall. And so I had to go out and earn extra money. So I started working with a company, and that general manager of that company uh, told me about a gentleman in Holland, Michigan. He ran a company called the Wisdom Link, and I think he's still there. So I got on a plane. I spent $7,500 US, which I didn't have at the time. And I went down and I sat for 2 days with this guy. And what he does is his company, I said, what do you do? He says, Tom, he said, we have people like you, the 1% in society or high income earners. most of them are very wealthier C-level people. He said they come to me lost and they're searching for something. So he said, what we do is we take the wisdom out of your head and we create it, turn it into some type of a business model so you can monetize it. We do something with your wisdom. I said, okay, well, I am kind of lost. So we're having a cocktail. My favorite cocktail comes from my wife, Anna, who's Italian, a martini. And we're sitting the night before I get in and having this dialogue. And he said, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a CEO by trade. And I also coach teams working with people. I help develop them. I build companies. And I said, I don't know. My mom always used to say to me, this is true, that people just want to be around you. They just want to talk to you. And I said, so I guess I just quietly go from one conversation to another, and people just open up and, kind of like a quiet warrior, I guess. I got a lot of strength in me, but I also have this quietness. And he said, I don't know if that's it, Tom, but he said, hold on to that thought because that could be the title of your first book. And that's where the quiet warrior actually name came from. And then when I created my company, which is a leadership and training development company, I went and created my own practice after 30 years of being an executive. I created a coaching framework called The Way of the Quiet Warrior, which is how I coach people. I own the IP, I registered it. So Kate and I, back to Kate, we're having this conversation. She said, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. I said, well, this is the story. This is the root of it. And this goes back to what I was trying to say about I didn't know who I was, but there's all this confusion. Something unconsciously was telling me quiet warrior fits, quiet warrior fits. But to take the thing you said about showing weakness, leaders don't show weakness, which we know now is a lie. You have to. Uh, I thought, man, most of the leaders out there are command and control style, the old school ones, right? Do as I say, not as I do, and there's no quiet about them. So I started feeling that the quiet warrior is kind of that's a weak kind of thing. But then the doctorate cracked it wide open. It's like, wait a minute. As I've just been saying to you, the strongest leaders in the world are those who have a quiet presence, who can show up, who can have a relational dialogue, but shut up and let you do most of the talking. And then we can have these thoughts, you build trust, psychological safety, so that you trust me, I trust you. Now you're starting to feel good. Now you want to perform at a higher level. But it's what happens in that quiet space. That's where the magic happens.
Mm.
Okay, so let's go back to quiet warrior. Quiet, every leader needs to be quiet. They need to shut up, pardon my language, but they have to be quiet. Because if I don't hear you and you're not seen and heard, you're not going to feel connected emotionally. Your brain's not going to trust me. You're not going to feel this is a psychologically safe workplace or a meeting or a space with Tom. And therefore, you're going to retreat in your mind. You're not going to open up and be who you are. So it's
Yeah,
like,
you're not going to be seen and you're not going to be heard.
exactly. So
Yeah.
quiet, but then the warrior is absolutely true. So I can get more done by having a relational orientation of a guy who can be quiet, a good listener, guy who can empathize, guy could open his space and hold it for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
But I'm also a warrior. I didn't become a CEO by being weak.
Mhm.
I've solved many, many problems where I've had to, walk through the fire, take the arrows and the bullets, restructuring, downsizing, dealing with collapsing companies, all that stuff. So I really believe the brand, the Quiet Warrior, is my brand. I am the Quiet Warrior. But when people ask me about that now, I say it differently. I have this quiet orientation. Some people might say I'm introverted, and I am. When you're with me and I'm really being me, this is work. So I
Mhm.
tend to glass of wine, sit and watch a movie with
Yeah.
my wife. But this quietness allows me to be the highest level leader because I can have have you grow and flourish in yourself and become the best you can be.
Mhm.
And then the warrior part is, yeah, you have to have that and
Yeah.
toughness, and that's what that is.
Yeah. If you look at the corporate world, or if you even look at history, who would be a good example of a quiet warrior leader?
Yeah, so the one that always comes to mind, connected again to my roots of India, is Gandhi, right? So Gandhi, the British, like the British left India, but
By
he
the
did
way,
it
he
with
he 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 had his formative years in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, where I come
it.
from.
Well, there's another thread. That's amazing.
And he was sentenced for something in my hometown, Dundee. Appeared in
Yeah.
court. I think it was in the early 1920s.
Wow. And
Yeah,
that's fascinating. The other interesting thread to him is that Gerametia slavery era. It was actually somebody who wrote a letter to him. He was the catalyst that was the beginning of the end of that whole Gamitia slavery chapter of history of the Indians who were sent around the world to work on plantations and things. But going back to what you said, it's interesting because before I learned about Bhagwan Ram and my dad's true story, I didn't really know who I was, and I didn't really like India. I just had this feeling, and even the people, I couldn't have time for it. My wife will tell you this if you ask her. She said sometimes, this is going back even before the injury, I would just have this feeling and I'd want to watch the movie Gandhi. And I bought the DVD and I bought it digitally too. And I would just sit down one night and put it on and I would just watch it. And I used to say to Anna, Mother India is calling me. But what was really happening, and this is interesting because leaders should take note of this, you can actually have conversations with people who are no longer with us. So you can sit down and you can get into a state in your brain of such calmness, meditative state, and you can actually connect with. So I used to watch the movie Gandhi and just having these feelings of deeply connecting to him as a person. And what was interesting is I used to watch him and I used to say to my friends, if you ever want to know how to be strong at the same time being quiet, watch the movie Gandhi. Watch what this guy does. He wouldn't let anybody fight. He said we're going to lay down our arm, but we're going to do it through peace, right? And Canada, it's interesting. I have my Canadian flag hanging proudly behind me. The nation of Canada gets poked on sometimes, saying, "Oh, you guys are too nice. You say sorry." And by the way, we say sorry because it's the right thing to do, not because we have to. But peace through strength. Canada is one of the strongest countries. Our special forces are used around the world. You don't even hear about it to go in and do things that are really tough, like take people out. But Canada is a peaceful country, but we do what we do, but we're strong because of that. Right. And Gandhi was an example. So I think again I rambled on that, but that in history, that's one person. The other person in history, I now can be proud to say and documented it in a thesis, uh, is me, where I used to say, there's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. I'm quiet. I'm all these things that were put in me. When I found the missing parts of the knowledge about who I was, my roots, I'm actually one of the strongest people you'll ever meet. And I never could say that with integrity. I used to think, I'm going to be arrogant, but I'll put myself up there any day with the lists of people. And I know I think I said this to you before, but I believe that people who have been traumatized or have been hurt are stronger than people who have had just totally happy lives. And I don't want to
yeah,
disparage people.
yeah. It's a strange thing, but I would agree is that people who've gone through terrible pain and through have transmuted this trauma like you have really delved very deep into their own soul.
Yeah, and let's go there for a minute if we have a bit of extra time here about delving into it. So you said what would be the advice to people? I think there's a lot of people out there who had trauma, but they don't know how to deal with it. And there's a stigma around mental illness and therapy, right? Therapists. You have to go and do the work. And it took a fall on my head and a couple of years of psychiatry to realize there was still more work to be done. But it wasn't until I was diagnosed with PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder. And imagine me being a leader in 30 years and living with uh, things of the past that would just manifest and be here in the present. Now, there's leaders all over the place that are like that. But here, why I bring this up is you have to do the work. So I encourage anybody who says, you know what, maybe I've had some trauma to go and do something like the ACE test. Go and even hire a counselor. It's a couple $100, some benefits cover it, and just do talk therapy. It's called psychotherapy. And by the way, I put this in my thesis too, that Carl Rogers, and he wrote a great book, which is on my book stack there. He sort of founded the whole thing behind talk therapy or psychotherapy, right? And he defined that there's some conditions that have to exist in the room for the person who has mental illness to actually grow. So let's just assume that you're the psychiatrist. So there's one of the conditions is there's two people in a room. One generally would be stronger mentally than the other. Okay. So there's you, and then there's me, kind of broken, right? Uh, Another condition that has to exist is you have to be able to see and hear the other person. You have to be able to let the other person feel psychologically safe. So I won't cite all his research, but my point is the only way you can dig out of yourself these painful things that are trapped, traumatic memories and emotions, is by being in a safe space where you can have somebody help you talk about it. And when I went into my first PTSD therapy session, it was crazy. And I can share this with you if it's okay. It was a woman, and so the modality she was using to help me was called EMDR. And if you haven't heard of it, I think it's important. EMDR is the gold standard for soldiers who come back with PTSD. Okay, first responders who have it, and it stands for eye movement desensitization reprogramming. I'm just looking at my paper here. And it's a therapy that helps the brain finish processing memories that it never properly filed away. So let's go one step deeper. When you get traumatized, there's memories, right? And I have my brain sitting in the back there underneath my TV screen. I call him Mr. Brain. So if I brought that out, deep in the deeper parts of the brain is things like the amygdala and the hippocampus. And so what happens is every moment of the day we see trauma everywhere. It's on TV, it's on social media, and then we have experiences we live, right? And the brain has an interesting process when you go into deep sleep and rest, almost at the REM sleep level. So REM is random eye movement. So, you see when people's eyes are going like that when they're sleeping, the brain, it's almost like it has a chemical process. I'm not quoting this right, that washes trauma. It cleanses it, and then it takes each thought and stores it in the deeper parts of the hippocampus in that part of the brain, and it stays there. What happens when you have PTSD is there's thoughts that get stuck and they don't get properly processed and put away. So when I went into EMDR, just to show you how much courage you have to do this, and I'm talking about it publicly now, which here's the other side of it. I'm a developer and a coach of other people. I work in business, right, as a CEO. I'm putting this out there publicly. You're going to put this out there. And I know that there's going to be some people that might say that guy's broken. We would never hire him. We would never get him to coach our people. And then there's other people who would say, no, we want that guy because he's got skills and lived experience that will help a lot of people. So going back to my own childhood, uh, I'm going to share this publicly, and it's very sensitive, but I'll share it. So in EMDR, what they do is they say to you, I want you to go back to as far as you can and find the thought that lingers the most, the thought that just keeps playing over and over again. And it's very hard. And they also tell you that, Tom, when you have thoughts and we're processing, it won't make sense. So I might be thinking all of a sudden about Rhino, and then I might see a picture of a clown. And she said, don't try to rationally connect it because trauma's like that, right? It's embodied, it's not properly stored away. It can show up. I can be sitting here with you and you appear something to be evil to me. So I found a thought that went back to when I was in grade school. And I'm not proud of this. And my mom's 90, so I love her dearly. And she did the best she could, right? And it wasn't her intention, but I used to be heavy set, a kind of a chunky kid. And my favorite pastime was eating O. Henry bars and Slurpees, those sugary ice drinks. And anyway, so I used to have a sweater. My mom used to put us dress this way. And I came home from school one day and I couldn't take my sweater off. And my mom would use very not so nice language to refer to me when she was angry, like fatso or whatever, fat shaming. Today they call it that. She didn't mean to, but she used to call me names. Well, one day I came home, Reno, and I think I was about 8 or 9, and we had a furnace room downstairs. We had a 2-story house. There was a big party room where Dad had all his drinking parties. And underneath the stairwell, so the stairwell's like this, there was a furnace room, and the hot water tank and cement floor was unfinished. That was the furnace room. The heater was in there. And so my mom gets really angry, and then she would use the wooden spoon and the Hot Wheel track, if you know what Hot Wheel toys are, these vinyl tracks. She would hit you, and she's just a petite little lady, right? And she took me down there, and she locked me into the furnace room. She put me in there. She said, "You're not coming out till you take your sweater off," because I couldn't get my sweater off because I just was very uncomfortable with myself. And so when we did EMDR, the one thought that was playing unconsciously over and over again was my mom putting me into the furnace room. This thought had me seeing danger in situations in my life, in business, in my marriage, it was crazy. It made no sense. So what happens in EMDR is the therapist will take their finger like this and they'll start move. So she'll say, okay, that one thought, let's work on that. So she'll do this, and then she'll say, I want you to follow my finger back and forth. That's all. She's doing it for about a minute. And then when she's done, she says, okay, where are you at now? What did you see? So then you explain what you saw. And so, for example, the first part of that, when I first tackled that, I said, okay, I closed my eyes and I was looking at her thing and I said, okay, I saw my mom, but I saw the back of her. She was all dressed up in a velour, in a outfit, and her hair was all done because her and my dad used to go out dinner dancing. But I only saw the back of her. I didn't see the front of her. And I said, and she said, what else did you see? I said, I saw the furnace room. And I said, all I remember seeing is the cement floor and this hot water tank. I don't remember anything else. I started vividly describing that. And then I said, all of a sudden, now I see my brother, my older brother. For some reason, I saw my brother's face pop into the picture. I said, it makes no sense because he wasn't in that room. And she says, Tom, don't try to make sense of it. She said, your brain is bringing back some of these things. We're trying to piece it together so that we can process it and finish the process, put away. So what we learned is that my older brother used to emulate my dad at times, and he would hit me and he would say things too that were nasty. And he's a year older. I love him dearly, but it's what it was. And he was traumatized by my dad's drinking too, right? So he was just a young guy. Well, his face came in the picture because that was connected to all of this feelings and these traumatic experiences. Well, guess what? After about 4 or 5 hours of processing like this, that thought just totally went away. Now I can think about and that thought, by the way, it got in my way at one point in my life, and I'm not proud of it, but I can tell you because I do it for a reason, where I couldn't go visit my mom. I couldn't talk to her. I couldn't spend time with her. I actually cut her off of my life. And I was told by somebody who had some very good experience in psychology that sometimes you need to set boundaries and move people out of your life, love them from a distance. And my mom's old school, right? Well, I'm your mother, you know. It's like, shut up, just go. I only need some time. But I could never go and sit in her room and have a conversation with her because I used to get this fearful feeling. Well, now you know the picture. So EMDR, why I told you all of that is for a reason. EMDR is the gold standard, and it is effective. But it was a single thought of my mom. You would look at it as maybe a healthy human being and say, suck it up, Tom. Your mom put you in a room to get your sweater off because you're being a whiner. That traumatized me my whole life, where I couldn't even go in gym class. I couldn't take my shirt off. I couldn't, when I became an adult, we used to go play football. That stayed with me. But just do the work, whether it's through psychiatry, see if there's something there, process it. My life has changed. I'm now healthier, and there's probably two of those thoughts. I won't tell you the other one that were there always. And I've met so many people coaching them where through just conversation, they've said, there's always this one thing or this one feeling that keeps coming up. And if it is a traumatic thing, chances are it's as simple as the brain just didn't finish its work and it's coming back all the time and it's triggered by something somebody does.
There's also a saying, the body holds the score. I found during my walks over several weeks on the
Yeah.
Camino
Yeah.
and speaking to numerous pilgrims going through the same process, that exactly those deep childhood memories would surface.
Yeah.
Uh, uh,
Well, you see
because
this
because
here.
the body would be releasing. Exactly. There we are.
So
The body keeps the score.
see that Ryan was a smart man, everybody. Why did I show you that picture? It just actually, yes, it's funny, Randall. Yesterday, a guy posts on LinkedIn. His name's Mr. Morris. He's a business guy, very wealthy guy locally. And he posts a thing. He says, "What's the best book you've read in the last year?" And I went through my Audible because I do about 4 audiobooks a month. By the way, you can develop your knowledge just by listening to audio. And I posted in LinkedIn, I said, "The Body Keeps the Score" by Bessel van der Kolk. And I also found his research when I did my doctorate. And if I may, without being repetitive, this is something I never understood. So I'm going to explain it this way to the audience. So this is a triangle. Okay, and this illustrates what your brain does. So one axis, your brain has thought. It attaches an emotion, and emotions show up as feelings or sensations, and then a behavior. Okay. So all your brain does is it has thoughts, and then it attaches an emotion, which is a feeling sensation, and then it tells your body what to do, a behavior. But where do the emotions, feelings, sensations go? They're in your body. Where is the thought? It's up here. So that's why that book you just quoted, which showed you, is a must read for people who don't, even if you are around people who may have had traumatized experiences, you need to understand that thoughts are here. You can change your thoughts. You can change the way your thoughts behave. You can say, "Thank you for saying I'm stupid, but I'm not. Goodbye," and go on. We, plants and animals, cannot have thoughts about their thoughts. We can actually take a thought and analyze it and then say, "Does it serve me well, or I'll put it away?" But what we don't realize until we do the work is you may have the thoughts, but the feelings and emotions are embodied and they're trapped. That's why they say trauma is trapped in the body. And so I used to have gut issues and
Yeah,
heartburn and all sorts of. If you're having those issues, people, you need to just
I,
realize it's one package, right? It's everything.
exactly. I think
Yeah.
it's the seed of disease, is my opinion. If the body hasn't transmuted trauma, it eventually leads to serious illness like heart disease
Yeah.
and cancer.
Well, it's
Why do
interesting
we
because
have epidemic percentages of heart disease and cancer? I think it's exactly this reason.
and you're the man who knows the El Camino, the Camino de Santiago. And I read your book, Deep Walking. I think it was called that, right? Deep Walking. What
Deep walking
the
for body,
deep
mind, and soul. Yes.
and that's where part reading your book years ago that put me on to. But again, I didn't stop because we're in a world where you're going fast all the time, and leaders do that. They don't stop to think. I never stopped to think about understanding this connection to the body and whatnot. And you can't just do work on the brain. You have to do work on everything. And I think you're right. And if we connect what you just said too about uh, illness and critical illnesses that come about, we can make that connection right back to what we talked about earlier, which is how we communicate and talk to each other. I mean, it all starts with how we relate to each other.
Yeah,
And if you think about it, just go right down to re-engineering how a company operates. Everything starts with two people having a conversation. And if we don't know, if we leaders have a rule that you can't be weak, you fail. The company will never be at its highest point. In
exactly.
my
Well, Tom, thank you so much for sharing your journey with such authenticity and honesty and depth. And I think your story is such a powerful reminder that even in life's most difficult moments, there is meaning to be found and strength to be forged. It's been a real privilege talking to you today. Thank you.
No, it's been my honor. Thank you too, Rhino.
Okay.